Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back, Karma Koala podcast. I'm here again with Steve DeAngelo. If you've listened to the first one, we spoke about his early years and Steve then arriving for some fairly strict schooling in, initially some strict schooling in India. It calmed down a bit. Welcome back, Steve. Let's jump straight in with your final moments in India before you headed off on your world travels yet again.
All right. Well, great to be back, Sean, and let's jump in. Leaving India was kind of interesting because we departed from what was then called Bombay, the Bombay airport. It's now known as Mumbai. And it was about 103 degrees. It was a really, really hot day in Mumbai. And unlike Hyderabad, which is in the desert and is arid heat, I was used to that. But in Bombay, it was this really muggy, humid heat. And so we were dripping with sweat, really dripping with sweat. And then we got on an airplane and we flew to Zurich, Switzerland, where there was about 2 feet, not 2 inches, or it seemed like 2 feet of snow on the ground. And it was this, very rapid, kind of abrupt transition from India.
That's a pretty abrupt transition from a Bombay of the early 70s to Zurich, because I remember as a child being in Switzerland as a young child, thinking this is the cleanest place I've ever been in my life.
And as if that was not enough, my father had a very interesting way of getting us through Europe and being able to afford it. And we were using a book that was entitled Eric Fromer's Europe on $10 a Day. And my father, of course, took that as a challenge. And so we were staying in the hotel run by the ladies, I think it was called the Women's Temperance Union. And so there was no alcohol allowed in the hotel. It was kind of almost like dorm rooms. There were shared bathrooms. And it was, if Zurich is clean, this place was ultra clean, spotless, run by the mainly church ladies from the Temperance Union. So yes, it was this very rapid transition. I was okay with it because they had a cafeteria there that had all kinds of pastries and milk and cheese and just a bunch of foods that I had not had for a couple of years while I was in India. So I focused on the food, and of course I wasn't drinking alcohol, and so it was all good with me.
For a child who's been, what were you eating, rice and curries and chapatis, and then being able to dive into sweet chocolatey things, I imagine absolute heaven.
It was indeed, yeah.
So how much time did you spend in Europe, and why were you there?
Well, we spent just over 3 months in Europe. We were there for 2 reasons. One, because my mother and father wanted to travel through Europe. That had always been a dream of theirs. And they finally were in a position where they could afford to do that. And the way my father never broke laws. He was quite strict about that, but he would bend them about as far as he could take them. And in those days, there was a very high tariff on luxury automobiles imported from Europe to the United States. And one of the ways that you could avoid that tariff was if your car was not a new car. And the cutoff date for a new car was 90 days. And so my father bought the car in Zurich, and we drove it on a probably 93-day tour through Europe.
Can I ask what the car was?
Yeah, it was a Mercedes-Benz 280E.
280E, yeah. I can understand why he might want to take that back to the US in the mid-70s.
Yeah, exactly. And so they, were able to accomplish a couple of dreams. My father was able to have the Mercedes that he had always wanted at about half the price that it would have been if he bought it in the US. And then they used the savings from that purchase to finance this 3 month trip through Europe with, 3 children, one of whom was, just under 2 years old. So my brother Andrew was born in India. My brother Daniel was still alive at that time. And so it was quite an ambitious undertaking by my parents. Looking backwards, I really appreciate that they were willing to take
It's very
that on.
funny because around exactly the same time, I think it would have been 1974. I did exactly the same thing with my mother and my stepfather in the back of a Jag, 3 children driving around Europe, and actually then driving down to South Africa as well, and driving through South Africa all the way up to Zambia. So
Oh
I know.
my goodness! So you drove from Europe to Africa and then
Well,
down south?
we drove from the UK all the way down through Europe, got on a boat in Italy. The boat took us down to Cape Town, and then we drove all the way through. My stepfather had worked in South Africa in the late 60s as a doctor. So then we drove up through to what was then Rhodesia still, which was very exciting for me because the Civil War was just starting. So I spent my whole time spotting bullet holes in all the hotels we'd stayed at.
Wow, what a magnificent trip! So
I,
yes, I
exactly.
already knew.
So I know exactly how you feel and how your parents must have felt with arguing children in the back of the car.
Yeah. Well, for the purposes of our conversation, other than that I got to take a trip through countries which no longer exist anymore, like Yugoslavia. I think the most formative part of that journey for me was when I got to London. And at that point, the countercultural revolution was in full flower in London. And I knew enough about it to know that I wanted to go to Hyde Park Square, and I knew that I wanted to go to Carnaby Street. And while we were at, I think is that the correct name, Sean? Hyde Park Square?
Well, it's Hyde Park, or there's Marble Arch, but it's more, there were lots of concerts in Hyde Park in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, before my time, obviously, but that was the famous Rolling Stones concert, 1968, or was it 69, after Brian Jones died, that kick-started them having concerts in Hyde Park.
Well, I didn't know that history at the time, but I did know about the free speech aspect of Hyde Park.
Hyde Park Corner. That's exactly right. Yeah. That's up by Marble Arch. That's quite right.
And it was amazing because I think, at least in those days, you could just drag a soapbox into the park, stand up on it, and start pontificating on anything that you wanted to. And people would go there, specifically to hear those things. And so I went to the park. I saw some of that action. And then there were hippies selling underground newspapers there. And the name of the newspaper was either It or If.
It was It. It was It.
Okay. And so I picked up as many copies. There was a hippie selling It there. And so I picked up as many copies of It as he had. And, like back issues. He had a couple back issues, and he had a current issue. And so I got loaded up with It when I was in this very formative period of my time and of my life. And then we went to Carnaby Street, which was kind of the center of hippie fashion. And I picked up a bunch of shirts that had flowers and ruffles and all kinds of stuff that I'd never seen before, but instantly resonated with me. And so did It. I mean, as soon as I saw the hippie in the park, as soon as I started reading It, as soon as I went to Carnaby Street, I was like, okay, this is my tribe.
No, I understand you totally. I mean, I did the same in London, but it had all moved to the King's Road and punk rock by the time I got to your sort of the age you're talking about now. So I know exactly how you feel. London does have that effect on a lot of people. Interestingly, of course, Carnaby Street and the King's Road are literally, as the crow flies, probably a mile away max from one another. These little central parts of London where counterculture, and that still happens now. You go further east now or further north. So all the young go to Camden or they go out to Brick Lane, I was just walking through the other day, and I think people still have those experiences now coming to London. It's a very exciting place to visit when you're young, I think.
Well, I hope that still happens in London. I know that in a lot of places around the world, certainly many neighborhoods I've lived in, hippies went into neighborhoods that nobody else was willing to go into. We were happy to live next to immigrants. We were happy to live next to Black people. We were seeking that kind of color and flavor in our lives. And when we went into these neighborhoods, they were typically, very low rent, and they were areas where a lot of other people, more straight people, weren't willing to go. And so, but as soon as we went there, we started doing cool things, concerts, poetry readings, doing the kind of creative stuff that our tribe does. And as we did that, we started attracting the very people who had fled those neighborhoods, started becoming attracted to them again. And you start seeing, little cafes popping up, where the dive bars used to be, and the white linen tablecloths and wine glasses, and that over time I began to recognize those cafes as a sign that the neighborhood was gentrifying. And I can't tell you how many neighborhoods that our tribe went into, revitalized, and then got priced out of and had to continue our trek looking for a home somewhere.
It's the same in cities all over the world. I've lived in a number of places. When I first went to Sydney in my late teens, there were various places you could go to, and they've gentrified a whole lot of areas, and but it always moves. Cities are great at reinventing themselves. So wherever people get moved on from, something starts happening somewhere else, which is the great thing about urban environments, I find.
Well, this is one of the things that, that for me counterbalances some of the ugly human behavior that we're seeing these days. Young people just naturally have this urge for freedom. They just naturally push against the bonds of expectations and traditions and rules. And it's one of the reasons that I say, I don't give a fuck who listens to me, as long as the young people are listening to me.
No, well, that's quite right. Well, and as long as they're listening to themselves, I think that's the most important thing. So in London, and just out of interest, do you remember hearing any specific music along with, picking up on the counterculture literature and the free speech?
I don't, unfortunately. I was there with my parents, and so I had to grab what counterculture I could. Excursion to Carnaby Street was my idea, and that was about as much of an immersion in hippie culture as I could get my parents to do. Now, to give you a bit of context, in those days, in India, my parents were working for the Peace Corps, and in those days, people who volunteered to be in the Peace Corps, the volunteers that my father was supervising, would get an exemption from the draft. So they didn't need to go to Vietnam if they went to India, Peace Corps volunteers. And of course, these were all people who, the sexual revolution was in full flower, and they were all weed smokers and probably were taking a fair amount of LSD at the same time. And so good
quality LSD as well.
Yeah. And it was my father's job to impose rules on that dynamic. And so he actually had to, or did, I don't know how much he was forced to or how much he relished it. But he sent Peace Corps volunteers home for having sex outside of marriage and for smoking weed in India. And so I used to hear these stories of my father coming home from work and talking about, sending people home for these activities. So that was his context for the counterculture. And so there was a limit to how far I could push them on that trip to London.
Fair enough. So, you spent a little bit of time in London. You did the 90 days in Europe, and then it was back to the US?
Back to the US. And, I landed back in this very sterile white suburb where my parents were actually, active in the fair housing movement. prior to going to India. And when we came back, we went into the same segregated white suburbs that we had been in before we went to India. And that neighborhood was dominated by a Catholic private school. And a lot of the families had actually moved to the neighborhood specifically to be close to St. Michael's Church and the school that the church ran. And so it was a very conservative neighborhood. And I felt, coming from India, it was just suffocating.
Well, I was about to say, after all that excitement and adventure, and again, I know how you feel because, growing up in the Caribbean, doing my trip around Europe at a young age, and then I got plonked in a boarding school here in England, aged 8 years old, having never really been schooled properly before. So I can identify with exactly how you feel, because the world, I always describe it as the world went from bright colors to black and white or gray suddenly.
Yeah, I mean, it's only looking backwards on that, Sean, that I can really appreciate how traumatizing it must have been for me to go from India, where I had all this freedom and I was running around the town and there was just Ganesh and curry spices and beggars on the street and everything different and everything colorful, back to exactly the same, back to a gray, sterile suburb, and then sent to a school where, any expressions of individuality were seen as defiance.
So, I mean, did that make you feel not academic about school at all? I mean, what happened when you were reintroduced into that school system?
Well, part of what happened was that I was smarter than my teachers. I had a lot of experiences in the world by then. I was more worldly than they were. They'd never traveled outside of the United States for the most part. And, I read all of these encyclopedias while I was in India. And so I was, remarkably well educated by that point, mostly self-education on my part. I had been reading a bunch of novels. I was pretty well educated, and I was dropped into these classes. And I will never forget, one experience that I had where a teacher wrote the name of Czechoslovakia on the chalkboard, and he misspelled Czechoslovakia, another country that doesn't exist anymore. And I challenged his spelling in the class, and he had to admit that he was wrong in front of the class. This guy's name was Richard Valentine. I'll never forget him because he tortured me. He tortured me for the rest of that school year. And if I'm remembering right, it was the beginning of the next school year, and they were getting ready to put me into his same class. And I managed to get myself kicked out of that school right around then.
So, I mean, what age were you at this point, and what year was that?
I guess I was probably 12 or 13 years old. When I got back to the US, I was put into a 6th grade class, which was in what we then called, or I think is still called, elementary school, grades 1 through 6. And then shortly after that, I was transferred from this small and again pristine white school, elementary school, into Tacoma Park Junior High School, which already had a reputation as being a quote unquote drug school and had a significant minority, but up to 40-45% of Black and Latino students. And so I was returned to a diverse environment, but it was a very charged environment. So at Tacoma Park Junior High School, we had very, very well-defined cliques. There were the hippies, there were the greasers, there were the jocks, and there were the grits. And everybody, sorted themselves into these various categories.
And I mean, most people would know all those terms. I don't know the grit. I'd be interested to know what a grit is.
Well, like rednecks and hillbillies.
Okay.
And they kind of, they were different from greasers because the greasers were like a more urban expression.
Of
of
that.
that kind
Okay.
of, retrograde, a reactionary kind of cultural manifestation, or at least I viewed it that way in those days. I probably would view it differently now. Country people, hillbillies, peckerwoods, crackers.
No, it's just interesting to know the terms, because I immediately know the term redneck, but I'd never heard the term grit before. So I've learned something today.
Well, do you know the food grits?
Yep, I know the food grits, so that's where it comes from.
And looking backwards, they were probably the children of working class white people who, like many black people in those years, were fleeing the oppression of the South and coming up to northern cities. I didn't see them as a positive manifestation. I didn't really understand their background in those days. So I'm sure I view it quite differently today, all of those subgroups. But in those days, we were at war with each other. And so one of the things that happened to me is I got a very quick education in violence, because especially the greasers, would try to attack me. By then, my hair was down to my shoulders, and they would do things like put bubble gum in my hair when I was walking through halls, or even in a class. They would jump me and try to cut my hair and beat me up. And so I got to the point where I was carrying a knife to school and never actually had to stab anybody, but had to back some people off. And so it was this, immediate immersion in social conflict. In those days, in the 70s, early 70s, we had the same kind of social hostility that we have these days between the Trump factions and the racists and the fascists who are on the march in this country again. And
and if you've been following your news, I know this is being made to be listened to in the future as well, but we've had a particularly sticky week in the UK this past week.
These fuckers are on the march all over the world.
I know. We'll have a different conversation about that, because otherwise we'll both start off and we won't get very far. Not a good learning environment.
Well, no, it was definitely not a good learning environment, but they didn't have anything to teach me. Really, I had already, educated myself on U.S. history through reading the encyclopedias in a more comprehensive way. A lot of the classes then were really mostly propaganda, and I realized that they were propagandists. And so the school administration was very corrupt, and they actually enabled the greasers to do what they were doing to me and other hippie kids, because the hippie kids would all gather out on the hill where there were trees growing. And it was a little bit, on the edge of the tree line by this school. And we could get away with doing stuff there. And so the school administration didn't really know how to stop us from doing that. And so they enabled the greasers. They basically turned a blind eye to the violence that the greasers were inflicting on the hippies, because they didn't like the hippies at all. And the greasers were something that they could live with. And so it was pretty clear to me that was going on. It's clearer to me looking backwards today. And the academic material was largely, not completely, but largely propaganda. The school authorities were corrupt, and I could see that because I was feeling the violence that their corruption engendered. And so school for me was an area of conflict, an area of battle. And so in succession, I got kicked out of that school. Then my parents, because of the way I got kicked out, I had gone, now they accused me of going into the gymnasium and stealing a flag, an American flag. And on the day that one of the really big demonstrations was happening in Washington, D.C., anti-war demonstrations, I climbed up to one of the trees over by the hill and I burnt an American flag. And I wasn't really doing it for the school authorities to see. I was doing it for the other hippies that were there to build our sense of defiance, because then I was getting ready to take a bunch of them down to the demonstration. And so later on, the school authorities accused me of stealing a flag from the gymnasium. That wasn't true. I had paid for that flag and bought it. And so I got kicked out of school for quote unquote stealing an American flag from the gymnasium and then burning it. With that history, it made it difficult for my parents to find then a private school. The Tacoma Park Junior High School was a public school.
Yeah.
And once I got kicked out of the free public school, then my poor parents had to search around to try and find a private school that would take me. And I went to interview after interview after interview. And of course, I was completely defiant in those interviews, and none of the schools would accept me between the history and the interview. So finally, what happened is my parents found a school. It was a boarding school, Sean, but I wasn't a boarder. They had day students and boarding students there. The reason that I behaved in the interview and therefore got into the school was that the school was being run by Quakers, which are this religious, I would call them a sect now, probably, or at least a religious manifestation in the United States. The Quakers are, at least in those days, some of them were extreme pacifists. And I got to know the Quakers because they had a 24-hour vigil that they were maintaining outside of the White House. And they maintained this vigil for peace in Vietnam until the war ended. And so I'd been to plenty of demonstrations down there and seen the Quakers, and they were on our side of that conflict. So I was like, okay, cool, a Quaker school, I can hang with that. And I went into the interview and I behaved, and I told them some, fairly accurate line of BS about what had happened at Tacoma Park Junior High School. And they believed it, and they welcomed me into the school, which I think they probably immediately began to regret once I was in their classes.
Did you, start to create relationships with other students at all?
Yes. Yeah, I didn't have any problem creating relationships with other students. I was, by that time, I was selling weed. In my time at Tacoma Park Junior High School, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I think I was probably just 13 years old. One of the first days I was in school, hanging out by the hill, a very pretty girl asked me if I wanted to go to a Mexican tea party. And of course, I knew exactly what she meant by that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yes. And I ended up at her parents' house. They were, out working for the day. And they had some joints of absolutely horrible Mexican weed that we smoked. And that was the prelude. Well, that was my first experience with cannabis. So I had good relations there, and we can return to that story if we haven't covered it already. And then Sandy Spring Friends School, which is where I ended up after Tacoma Park Junior High School. I was already selling weed. I basically started selling weed as soon as I found out about it. And so I was, again, out in the woods at Sandy Spring Friends School, which was in a more rural area than Tacoma Park Junior High School. And there was all these wooded areas. And so I was selling weed back in the wooded areas when I wasn't getting into trouble in the classroom. And so I had great relations with the kids. They all, pretty much loved me. The one exception to that, and probably the precipitating event that led Sandy Spring Friends School, they didn't exactly kick me out. They just didn't invite me to return the next year. Mm-hmm. And part of that was that during our summer break, or maybe I guess it was the spring break, the school, in a very cool way, had experiential learning experiences. And one of them was to take a van full of 11 young teenagers, down to Mexico with two faculty members who attempted to chaperone us. And I was like, woohoo, on our way to Mexico. Yeah, baby, Even before we got to Mexico, we stopped at a Pizza Hut in Texas. And by that time, I had a small mustache and big bushy afro hair. Pizza Hut was serving pitchers of beer, and I ordered one, and they served it to me. And so the teachers came upon our table and saw this big pitcher of beer sitting there, and of course confiscated it from us before we had a chance to even drink any. Then we finally got to Mexico, where there was no drinking age. And our first night in the hotel in Mexico, I led a expedition of a few other of the guys who were rooming with me out to a bar. And it was this classic Mexican bar with like swinging wood panel doors. It was, there were no chairs. There was sawdust on the floor. And we went in there and drank Boilermakers, because I'd seen my grandparents drinking Boilermakers, beer with whiskey poured in them. And I think in this case, it was probably tequila. And we got absolutely trashed. And interesting story there, again, reflective of why I got kicked out. The one kid who refused to come on the expedition had fallen asleep before we left, because we had to wait until the teachers were asleep to go. Yeah. He fell asleep on his bed, and we tied his shoes to the bed with his shoelaces. And then we came back, of course, absolutely trashed. And I woke up in the morning and walked into the bathroom, and I found our sink in pieces. I don't know if you've ever seen a porcelain sink broken. It's quite dramatic. And a friend of mine who had been staying in on a room, not our room, in a different room, was passed out on the floor with his thumb stuck into the pipe of the sink, which was not a completely successful attempt to stop it from squirting water all over the floor.
It sounds somewhat like similar school trips that I'd taken in there, but 10 years later, basically. Things don't change, do they? Steve, that's a great note on which to finish your current adventures. Look forward to your next adventures in the next episode.
Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it. So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."